The Roman Saturnalia, role reversal and total chaos. If we could time travel to Rome 2,000 years ago during December, we wouldn't find angelic carols or scenes of peace and love by the fireplace. Instead, we'd stumble into a scene resembling a cross between an anarchic purge and an out-of-control frat party that lasted a full week. Welcome to Saturnalia, the true grandmother of our Christmas, albeit a grandmother with a drinking problem and a tendency toward absolute social chaos. Saturnalia was held to honor Saturn, the god of agriculture, liberation, and time. Ironically, the festival was about breaking time and order. It began on December 17th and, depending on the imperial era, stretched to the 23rd. During these days, the cry of Io Saturnalia echoed through the streets of Rome like a festive war cry. What made this festival truly unique and terrifying for the conservative elite was the complete inversion of social norms. Imagine a world where law and order are temporarily suspended, schools closed, courts shut down, and declaring war was forbidden. But the most shocking events happened inside the home. Slaves were released from their duties. In many cases, roles were literally reversed. Masters served dinner to their slaves. Slaves could wear their lord's clothes, mock them to their faces, and play dice with them without fear of reprisal. It was a social safety valve, a week where the world turned upside down to release the pressure built up during the year. Gambling, usually forbidden or frowned upon for the plebs, became the main event. Coins, nuts, and properties were wagered on every corner. The city plunged into a state of collective drunkenness and debauchery. The poet Catullus called it the best of days. Seneca, the Stoic, complained that all of Rome has gone mad. Central to this madness was the election of the Saturnalius Princeps, or the King of Saturnalia. In every household or community, a person, often of low status, was chosen to be the king of chaos. His orders, no matter how absurd or humiliating, had to be obeyed. Sing naked, dance in cold water, insult the patrician. This king of chaos is the direct ancestor of the medieval Lord of Misrule, and, in a much more diluted form, the hidden bean or figurine found today in the king cake, or rosca de reyes. When Christianity began to gain power, it faced a problem. Nobody wanted to give up Saturnalia. It was too much fun. The church, in a brilliant marketing maneuver, decided not to ban the party, but to absorb it. They kept the dates, the holly and ivy, and the gift-giving, originally wax candles and clay figurines called sigillaria, but changed the host. Saturn was evicted, and Jesus moved into December 25th, a date conveniently coinciding with Sol Invictus, the rebirth of the sun. So, when you overeat and overdrink at the table, or feel like family dinner is a lawless chaos, you aren't failing at Christmas. You are unknowingly honoring the old Saturnalia. Yule and the Nordic Boar sacrifice. While the Romans were getting drunk in the south, up in the frozen north of Europe, Germanic and Scandinavian peoples celebrated something much more visceral and dark: Yule. If you think Christmas is cozy, Yule is here to remind you that winter is a time of death, darkness, and survival. Yule marked the winter solstice, the turning point where the night was longest and the sun seemed on the verge of dying forever. To convince the sun to return, blood was required. The central god of Yule wasn't a baby in a manger, but Odin, the All-Father. But at this time of year, Odin adopted one of his most terrifying forms, the leader of the wild hunt. It was believed that during the longest nights of Yule, the veil between the world of the living and the dead became dangerously thin. Odin rode across the stormy sky, accompanied by an army of specters, ghost dogs, and lost souls. Hearing the howling wind wasn't just weather, it was the sound of the hunt passing over your roof. If you were unlucky enough to be outside and see them, you could be dragged to the underworld or driven mad. The only protection was to stay inside, drink ale, and hope the darkness passed. But Yule wasn't just fear.
It was fertility and sacrifice. The most potent symbol of this festival was the boar. In Norse mythology, the boar was sacred to Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity. To ensure the harvest returned next year and the sun regained its strength, the sonargolter, the sacrificial atonement boar, was performed. The ceremony was solemn and brutal. A boar, often considered the embodiment of the forest's life force, was brought into the great hall. Warriors and men of the house placed their hands on the animal's bristles and swore unbreakable oaths for the coming year. These Yule oaths were sacred contracts sealed in blood. Breaking them meant dishonor and death. Once the oaths were made, the boar was sacrificed and its meat served in a massive feast. This tradition is the direct origin of the Christmas ham that many cultures still place at the center of the table. When you slice that roast pork, you are reenacting a pagan sacrifice to Freyr. The Yule log, which we eat today as chocolate cake, was originally a real log, an entire oak tree brought into the home. It was lit with the remains of the previous year's log and had to burn for 12 consecutive days to ward off evil spirits and fuel the rising sun. The ashes were kept as medicine and protection against lightning. Yule reminds us that Christmas at its core is a feast of defiance against the darkness. We light lights, eat fats, and drink alcohol not just for joy, but as an ancient mechanism of magical defense against the deadly winter lurking just outside our doors.
Krampus, Santa Claus's demonic shadow. Today, the Christmas narrative is binary but soft. If you're good, you get gifts. If you're bad, you get coal. And let's be real, most modern parents don't even give coal. But in the Alpine region of Europe, Austria, Bavaria, Slovenia, the Christmas justice system was much more severe and terrifying. Saint Nicholas, the benevolent saint who brought gifts, never traveled alone. He needed an enforcer, a shadow. That enforcer is Krampus. Krampus is the antithesis of everything modern Christmas represents. He is a beast, half goat, half demon, with matted black fur, long twisted horns, and a red forked tongue that hangs unnaturally from his mouth. While St. Nicholas carries a sack of toys, Krampus carries rusty chains, loud cowbells to announce his arrival, and, most disturbingly, a bundle of birch branches called a ruten. The ruten isn't decorative. Krampus uses it to whip children who have misbehaved. And we aren't talking about a symbolic spanking. The legend suggests real physical punishment. But the whipping is the best-case scenario. If a child had been truly wicked, Krampus didn't waste time with branches. On his back, instead of toys, he carries a wicker basket or an old sack. Legend says he stuffs incorrigible children into that sack, takes them to his lair in the mountains, and, well, versions vary. Some say he drowns them, others say he eats them, and the optimists say he simply drags them to hell. The night of December 5th is Krampusnacht, Krampus night. Historically, and still today in many alpine cities, young men dress in heavy furs and horribly realistic hand-carved wooden masks to run through the streets, chasing passers-by, hitting their legs with branches, and ringing their bells. It is a night of controlled terror, a release of aggression repressed in the dead of winter. For centuries, the Catholic Church tried to ban Krampus. He was too pagan, too demonic, too uncontrollable. In the 20th century, even the fascist government of Austria tried to eradicate the tradition, deeming it the work of social democrats or a corruption of Christian purity. But Krampus survived everything. He survived because he represents a psychological truth that the sanitized version of Santa Claus ignores. Fear is a powerful motivator. Ancient Christmas understood that light has no meaning without darkness, and that reward is not valued if there is no real threat of a monstrous punishment. Krampus is the monster required for Saint Nicholas to be the saint.
Gryla and the Yule Cat.
who eats kids with old clothes. If you thought Krampus was bad, wait until you meet the dysfunctional family terrorizing Iceland. The Icelanders, living on an island of ice, fire, and perpetual darkness during winter, created some of the most brutal Christmas myths in history. At the center of this nightmare is Gryla. Gryla isn't a goat demon, she is a gigantic ogress. It is said she lives in a cave in the Dimmu lava fields and has the ability to detect children who misbehave throughout the year. Unlike Santa, who watches to judge you, Gryla watches to hunt you. During Christmas, she descends from the mountains with a giant sack. Her goal is simple: capture disobedient children, stuff them in the sack, and take them back to her cave to boil them alive and make a stew. She is a cannibalistic predator, and she is one of the oldest figures in Icelandic folklore, mentioned in 13th century sagas. In fact, she was so terrifying that in 1746, a public decree was issued in Iceland banning parents from using Gryla to intimidate their children because the kids were getting legitimately traumatized. But Gryla doesn't come alone. She has 13 sons, the Yule lads or Yule lads. Today, they have softened into mischievous elves, but originally they were monsters, each with a specific way of harassing humans: the spoon licker, the door slammer, the sausage swiper. However, the family pet is perhaps the strangest and most cruelly capitalist creature in all of Christmas mythology, the Yule Katoran, or the Yule Cat. Do not picture a cute kitten. The Yule Cat is a gigantic beast, bigger than a house, prowling the snowy fields, peering into lit windows. Its prey? Not necessarily bad children. The Yule Cat hunts anyone who hasn't received new clothes for Christmas. Yes, you read that right. The threat of death and devouring is not based on your moral behavior, but on your economic output. In ancient rural Iceland, wool processing was vital for survival. The whole family, from children to the elderly, had to work hard in the autumn to shear, spin, and weave the wool before the worst of winter hit. If the work was completed, everyone received a new garment as a reward. If someone had been lazy, they got no new clothes. So, the Yule Cat functioned as a monstrous factory supervisor. If you didn't have new clothes, it meant you hadn't worked hard enough. The cat saw you, judged you as a useless slacker, and ate you. This legend taught a cold, hard lesson necessary for survival in a hostile climate. If you don't contribute to the community, you don't deserve to survive the winter. It is the most brutal version of seasonal fashion that has ever existed.
Why do we put dead trees in the living room? Look at the corner of your living room. There is a tree, probably a pine or a fir. You've cut it down, effectively killing it, dragged it inside your house, and covered it in lights and tinsel. If an alien saw this without context, they'd think it was a bizarre ritual, and they'd be right. It is a deeply pagan ritual of sympathetic magic and nature worship that Christianity tried to eradicate without success before finally giving up and adopting it. The obsession with evergreen plants, those that don't die or lose their leaves in winter, is universal in the ancient cultures of the Northern Hemisphere. For the Celts, Vikings, and Romans, seeing that the entire vegetable world died and turned brown except for the fir, holly, and mistletoe was a divine sign. These plants held the secret of eternal life. Bringing them inside the house was a form of magic. You were inviting the spirits of the forest to take shelter in your home, and in return, you hoped the plant's vitality would protect your family from death and sickness during the winter. Romans decorated their temples with fir trees during Saturnalia. Egyptians filled their homes with green palms during the winter solstice. But the tree tradition as we know it comes directly from Germanic paganism and their veneration of sacred trees.
The Germanic peoples believed in Yggdrasil, the world tree that holds up the universe. They also worshipped specific sacred trees like Thor's oak. Christian legend tells that Saint Boniface in the 8th century stumbled upon a group of pagans about to sacrifice a child under Thor's oak in Germany. To stop them, Boniface cut down the oak with a single blow, or with a blow and a divine gust of wind. Behind the fallen oak grew a small fir tree. Boniface told them this was the tree of Christ. Its wood was the wood of peace, for building houses, not weapons. Its evergreen leaves represented eternal life, and its triangular shape pointed to heaven, to the Trinity. Although Boniface's story is ecclesiastical propaganda, it reveals the real conflict. The church hated tree worship. However, the tradition persisted in Germany. In the Middle Ages, paradise trees appeared in mystery plays performed on December 24th, the feast day of Adam and Eve in the Old Calendar. They were fir trees decorated with apples, symbolizing forbidden fruit, and wafers, symbolizing the Eucharist. Over time, apples became red glass balls, and wafers became cookies, giving rise to our modern ornaments. But the fundamental act remains the same. We bring a piece of wild nature into our civilized space. It is an atavistic reminder that even though we live in heated houses, we still depend on the cycles of the earth. The tree in your living room is an ancient totem, a vegetable hostage we bring inside to remind us that spring will return.
The real Saint Nicholas, a Turkish bishop, not a polar elf. The modern image of Santa Claus, fat, jolly, dressed in Coca-Cola red and living at the North Pole surrounded by elves, is a very recent invention, a mix of Dutch folklore, 19th century New York poems, and commercial illustrators. The real man behind the myth, Saint Nicholas of Bari, was much more interesting and, frankly, much tougher. Nicholas wasn't from the North Pole. He was Greek, born in the 3rd century in Patara, in what is now the coast of Turkey. He wasn't a magic toy maker, he was the bishop of Myra. And far from being a passive grandpa who only laughs, Nicholas was a fierce and combative defender of his faith and his people. He lived during the great persecution of Emperor Diocletian, which means he likely spent time in prison, was tortured for his faith, and watched many friends die. He was a hardened survivor, not an elf. One of the most famous and possibly apocryphal, but delicious, stories about his temper occurred during the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The church was debating the nature of Christ. A priest named Arius argued that Jesus was not equal to God the Father. According to legend, Nicholas became so enraged by Arius's heresy that he crossed the council floor and slapped him across the face in front of Emperor Constantine himself. He was imprisoned for this, but the story shows us a man of passionate action, not the docile saint of greeting cards. The origin of gifts and stockings hung by the fireplace comes from a rather sordid story. It is said that a poor father in Myra had 3 daughters. Since he had no money for their dowries, the daughters were condemned not to marry and, very likely, to be sold into prostitution or slavery to survive. Nicholas, learning of this, wanted to help, but in secret, so as not to humiliate the father. During the night, he threw bags of gold through the open window of the house. One of the bags, legend says, fell into a stocking or sock that was drying by the fire. Hence the tradition of hanging socks, hoping they fill with gold or oranges and chocolate. Nicholas became the patron saint of almost everyone: sailors, repentant prostitutes, pawnbrokers, thieves, and, of course, children. His fame spread across Europe. In the Netherlands, he became Sinterklaas, a tall, serious bishop who arrived by boat from Spain, a curious historical confusion, riding a white horse. When Dutch immigrants arrived in New Amsterdam, now New York, they brought Sinterklaas. English speakers mispronounced the name, turned it into Santa Claus, stripped him of his bishop's mitre, put him in a fur suit, and moved him to the North Pole. but beneath the red suit beats the heart of a Turkish bishop with a bad temper who didn't tolerate heresy or injustice.
The 17th century ban on Christmas. It was illegal to celebrate. Nowadays, the war on Christmas is a recurring theme on conservative news if a coffee cup doesn't have enough snowflakes. But in the 17th century, there was a real war on Christmas, and it wasn't waged by atheists or pagans, but by the most devout and fanatical Christians in history, the Puritans. For the Puritans in England and later in the American colonies like Boston, Christmas was not a Christian holiday. It was a popish abomination full of idolatry. They argued, correctly, that the Bible does not mention Jesus' birth date, and that December 25th was simply a coat of paint over the pagan festivals of Saturnalia and Yule. But what they hated most wasn't the date, but the behavior. In the 17th century, Christmas in England looked more like a violent Mardi Gras than a mass. People got drunk, ate until they burst, gambled, and often raided the homes of the rich, demanding food and drink, a tradition called wassailing, which was basically musical extortion. Give us figgy pudding or we won't go. When Oliver Cromwell and the Puritan forces took power in England after beheading King Charles I, they decided to cleanse the nation. In 1644, Parliament officially banned Christmas. Churches were forcibly closed on December 25th. Shops were ordered to stay open, and people were told to work as if it were a normal day. Soldiers patrolled the streets of London, confiscating festive food. If you were caught cooking a goose or a mince pie, you could be fined or arrested. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg became the scent of illegal resistance. This provoked massive riots. The people, fed up with Puritan austerity, took to the streets. There were fistfights in Canterbury, where protesters played football in the streets in protest and shouted royalist slogans. Christmas became a political symbol of resistance against Puritan tyranny. In America, the ban was just as severe. In Boston, celebrating Christmas was illegal between 1659 and 1681. The law set a fine of 5 shillings for anyone caught feasting or not working. In fact, Christmas did not become a federal holiday in the United States until 1870. For nearly 2 centuries, in much of Protestant America, December 25th was just another workday. Christmas as we love it was a Victorian reinvention that had to fight the church itself to exist. Christmas ghost stories. Before Dickens, it was horror season. When we think of Christmas stories, we think of miracles, family reunions, and redemption. But there is an older tradition, one that Charles Dickens made famous with A Christmas Carol, but did not invent: telling ghost stories. The connection between Christmas and horror is logical if we remember its roots in Yule. It is the darkest time of the year. The sun has died, the shadows are long, the wind howls. People are gathered around the fire, the only point of light in a black world. What better time to talk about what lurks in the darkness? During the Victorian and Edwardian eras in Britain, the quintessential Christmas tradition wasn't watching a romantic movie, but scaring each other to death. December literary magazines were full of macabre tales of vengeful spirits, haunted houses, and mysterious murders. The line in the song "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year" that says there'll be scary ghost stories is a remnant of this tradition that most people ignore today. The absolute master of this genre wasn't Dickens, but M.R. James, a Cambridge academic in the early 20th century. James had a tradition of inviting his students and colleagues to his office on Christmas Eve, turning off all the lights except a single candle, and reading a new ghost story he had written specifically for that night. His stories didn't have comforting morals like Dickens. They were unsettling tales about ancient demons awakened by curious archaeologists.
sheets coming to life to smother sleepers, and hairy things touching your hand in the dark. This tradition of Christmas horror has a psychological purpose. By bringing fear into the safe and warm circle of the hearth fire, we domesticate it. Sharing a horror story in a group creates social cohesion. We get scared together and comfort each other together. It is a way of acknowledging the darkness of winter without letting it consume us. So this year, when you finish dinner, turn off the lights. Don't put on a cartoon. Follow the old tradition. Tell a story about a specter, about Krampus, about the Yule Cat. Because Christmas, at its deepest origin, has always been about the monsters waiting just outside the circle of light from our bonfire, and about our wonderful and defiant capacity to celebrate life despite them.